Can philosophy guide us in making difficult political and moral decisions? Is it right, for example, to build a huge dam for a power plant deep in the rainforest of Borneo in Malaysia?
I think we should have a very broad outlook, what's going on in the third world. Is it really so that they look forward to be like us? That they look forward to have our technology, our high standard of living, and so on. So there we have a great job in cooperation with a minority in the third world to reject this grandiose, enormous, and very harmful projects.
If the benefits are large enough, can any political decision be justified? The Prime Minister of Malaysia has defended the dam project against environmentalist critics, saying, "You in the West cannot control the development of our country. We have a plan to transform Malaysia into a fully industrialized nation before the year 2020. The Ba Kun Dam is part of that plan."
You want us to be preserved like in a museum. You want to keep the good life for yourself, and you want us to be held back at the different sort of life that we have.
The project is already underway, and the multinational company ABB is eagerly awaiting approval of a large contract. 30 villages would be evacuated, 10,000 people moved, and more than 150,000 acres of rainforest destroyed. Opponents of the dam argue that these transformations of the environment will do irreparable harm. Defenders counter that such costs will be far outweighed by benefits, such as economic growth for the entire nation. This sort of balancing of costs against benefits has roots in an ethical theory called utilitarianism.
I think the most important thing about being a utilitarian is that you judge actions in accordance with their consequences. Things are not just right or wrong in themselves, irrespective of the difference they make in the world. And I think that it's important that we make a difference in the world and not that we stick by some abstract principle which might say, for example, always tell the truth, but then might have disastrous consequences for everyone. And I see no point in sticking by a principle without paying attention to the consequences of what you're doing. So that's the first and most important aspect for me of being a utilitarian.
The utilitarian movement was founded in the late 18th century by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. He came from a family of lawyers and was trained to be a lawyer, but he didn't practice the profession. Instead, he dedicated himself to the reform of the British legal system and social policy. Bentham's central proposal was deceptively simple. He wrote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do." Bentham proposed designing all laws and social policies with one goal: maximize the amount of pleasure in society and minimize the amount of pain. Show no favoritism to individuals, but seek only to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Philosopher Ross Harrison has written a book about Bentham.
The importance of Bentham is he really worked out a utilitarian theory. So it wasn't just the starting point, but you developed what that actually was and then applied it to lots of different areas. I mean, you've got a psychological theory, you've got a value theory, you put them together, you get a theory of politics, of law, of society. And it's that whole development that makes Bentham important.
Bentham was a child of the Enlightenment. Although he dealt with emotionally charged issues, he proposed resolving them entirely through reason. He totally opposed maintaining policies simply on the grounds of custom or traditional authority.
The big Enlightenment thing as a questioning operation is to say, well, why? What justifies it? At what point? I mean, why are these the right things to do? They are the things that have happened. They've got custom. But if we ask for reason rather than custom, why we should do these things, then we've got to think of a new way of justifying or establishing them. And we've got to, as it were, produce straight new foundations, not take authority, not take the facts written in some book, sacred or otherwise. I mean, it might be Aristotle, it might be the Bible. Not take authority, not take the book, not take the custom, or anything like that. We've got to try and take some reason.
If we reason as Bentham suggested, how will we come out on a decision such as whether or not to build the Bakun Dam? How can we calculate which course will truly lead to the greatest happiness for the greatest number?
I think the only way to reason is to try to predict the effects as far as possible on everyone involved, now and future, and not only human beings, but also non-human sentient beings, animals who may live in the forests that are destroyed by the project, and try to estimate whether the benefits will be clearly greater than the consequences.
What will be the consequences of building the dam? Will it make a majority of the Malaysian people happier by giving them a higher standard of living? If happiness is measured in economic terms, the answer is probably yes. But not everybody in Malaysia dreams of a modern life in the city.
We've seen how people live in the city. They make little money and cannot support their families. Here we live from the soil, and we have everything we want.
Can we sacrifice the happiness of one group for the benefit of the larger society? Is the total balance of pain and pleasure the only thing that counts? Bentham founded University College, London. At his bequest, his body is preserved there.
And one thing people know about or find surprising is Bentham's desire to preserve himself as a physical body, the so-called auto-icon in University College, London. Bentham himself is actually there in a sort of telephone box. There's a sort of glass-fronted thing, and then there's this body inside, which is Bentham's body. It's not actually his head, though. He tried to get his head preserved by studying the sort of New Zealand head shrinkers and preservation, but the thing looks so ghastly. They took it off after 10 years and put a sort of wax head on top, but you've actually got the skeleton there dressed in Bentham's clothes. And deaf it is now, but you get celebratory dinners sometimes at University College, and they bring Bentham along to the dinner. So you say, you've got your chance of coming to dinner, and Bentham will be there as well.
The second great figure in the utilitarian movement was the 19th century English philosopher John Stuart Mill. Mill's father was a friend and follower of Bentham, and he put his son through a rigorous education, starting with Greek at age 3, Latin at age 7, and a strong dose of utilitarian theory.
And when Mill was a young man, he got together some like-minded people, and they all believed very strongly in Bentham when they were all very young men trying to solve the world. And they met together in Bentham's house. James Mill lived next door, and they met in Bentham's house, and they were a little society promoting Bentham's ideas. They called themselves the Utilitarians.
But at the age of 20, Mill suffered a nervous breakdown. As he later wrote, "The habit of analysis has a tendency to wear away the feelings." As he recovered, he set about writing the balance in his life.
Mill, I think throughout his life, was a very open character. He wanted to combine lots of different kinds of thought. He was putting together the best of the 18th century, the best of the 19th century. So he's a compromising thinker. And in respect to, if you could sort of press it onto the mental crisis, the thought if I just try to aim at the greatest happiness, the greatest number, at least as conceived by Bentham, I myself am not going to be happy. There's more to life than that. And as he conceived it, the more to life was poetry.
As he recovered, Mill also diverged from the ideas of Bentham. For Bentham, there was only one standard of value. Whether it's called pleasure, happiness, or utility, it can be quantified. Mill complicates the picture by arguing that there are higher and lower pleasures. Quality matters. In his words, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Through the years, many philosophers have been attracted to the basic idea of utilitarianism, to weigh the good against the bad. But they've looked for ways to add finesse to Bentham's simple quantitative approach.
I find that very hard to answer as to whether I'm a utilitarian. If you take traditional definitions of utilitarianism, that all that matters is pleasure and the absence of pain, no, I'm certainly not a utilitarian. But utilitarians have characteristically responded to criticism, not by rejecting criticisms, but by embracing them with a kind of bear hug, by making their theory more and more complex to accommodate the different criticisms that are made. If you make consequentialism sufficiently pluralistic and still call it utilitarianism, then you could say that I was a utilitarian.
In most people's view, finding any objective measure of pleasure and pain is a difficult problem. The problem becomes vastly more difficult when you try to compare one person's pleasures or pains with those of another.
There certainly is a problem about comparing the happiness of different people. It, I think, would be a bit absurd to say that my holiday in Italy made me 2.54 times as happy as your holiday in Ireland made you. We can't make precise interpersonal comparisons, but still I think, as any parent knows, you can sometimes, again, make rough and ready comparisons. A parent who has to decide whether to spend some money on giving one child a holiday or sending another child to a better school does in fact make some kind of intuitive comparison about which will matter more in the life of the particular person. We may often get it wrong. We certainly can't do it precisely. But I think, again, it's too naive to think that we can't do it at all, which is what the strong case against utilitarianism sometimes suggests.
The Swedish philosopher Torbjörn Tansu views utilitarianism as a kind of research project. The basic idea is clear and simple, but the details need to be worked out in different and complex ways. When asked whether he considers himself a utilitarian, Tansu replies,
Jag skulle nog ändå gissa att den moraliska sanningen så att säga ligger i den riktningen.
There are many questions that it does not answer, but the moral truth points in that direction. My belief is that utilitarianism gives a more adequate answer than any other moral theory. There are lots of ways to criticize utilitarianism. It implies certain consequences which are considered to be in opposition to our daily morality when taken to extremes. One reason for criticism is that utilitarianism asserts that the end justifies the means. There are no actions which are forbidden in themselves. For instance, if one was to kill a person, and it is proved that the consequences are better than if one was to refuse the killing, then according to utilitarianism, the killing is the right thing to do. Another reason for criticism is that utilitarianism seems to demand a great deal from us. It demands that we shall act so as to get the best consequences.
Utilitarianism requires that we predict the future consequences of our actions. This is difficult in the real world. In Malaysia, there has been a recession. The economy can no longer support a large-scale project such as the Bakun Dam. The future of the project is in doubt.
Utilitarismen är väldigt krävande på...
Utilitarianism demands a lot of empirical knowledge to reach even a plausible opinion. This makes you humble. I have sometimes made up my mind on medical ethical matters, but only after years of study of the question at issue.
There's something about utilitarianism, about its way of proceeding, which invariably undercounts the difficulties. And that's because the downside is invariably much more complex and difficult to trace than the upside. I mean, take this business of moving people. What, of course, can't be properly costed is their entire embedding in their way of life, the way in which that gives them a sense of morale and importance in their lives, all the skills that are going to be totally made irrelevant that they now have, which will be totally wiped out, skills which are now producing important things. All that is not only extremely important to cost, but at a certain moment you just throw up your hands. How do you ever cost that? So invariably, this attempt, even with the best will in the world, and even in its own terms, is going to leave out something that is absolutely relevant. Consequently, these projects very often, just even in their own terms, are catastrophically badly calculated. The downside is always bigger than it was thought to be, and very often the thing turns out to be a great negative. And of course, it's also irreversible. So it's a formula for social catastrophe.
At the turn of the 20th century, Cambridge philosopher George Edward Moore presented a theory called ideal utilitarianism. He argued that there are other intrinsic goods besides pleasure. Art and love, for example, are also goods that the utilitarian should maximize. Moore's ideas were a source of inspiration to a group of intellectuals in London known as the Bloomsbury Group. Leading members of the group, such as the writer Virginia Woolf, her sister Vanessa Bell, the economist John Maynard Keynes, and the writer Vida Sackville-West, extended Moore's ideas. They asserted that only certain refined states of consciousness have intrinsic value. But are there values that apply both in London and in the rainforest of Borneo? What about nature? Does it have a value of its own, an intrinsic value, or is it just a means to human happiness?
Utilitarianism comes out very strongly on one side of a quite deep debate about environmental issues. Some people think that the world or the universe or the environment in general has a kind of moral standing of its own, so that it's intrinsically wrong to devastate a beautiful valley, even if no one is ever going to see it, for instance. Utilitarianism rejects that view totally. All that matters is the impact on human beings and other conscious beings.
The Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, by contrast, holds that nature has a value of its own.
I personally feel also that a mountain has a certain dignity, especially one mountain here in Norway has a certain dignity that could be violated. You cannot do so and so. On top of these mountains you cannot have any kind of building and so on. It's against the dignity. But that would be individual differences there, where you draw the line between living and not living. For me, this mountain is a living entity.
Does Næss go too far when he claims that a mountain has a moral standing of its own and that we should respect its dignity?
Det är en fascinerande tanke.
It's an interesting thought, but in the end I think he makes a serious mistake. The conclusion of his drastic ideas is that humanity will have to be surrendered. If one takes into account these aesthetic values, we are very far from Bentham's traditional version of utilitarianism.
In the 1970s, Ness founded the so-called deep ecology movement to help in the struggle against building dams and power plants on the rivers of Norway.
It is mainly to make people aware of things, aware of certain values and to make them aware. So it's communication with the people, communication with the majority, of course.
The Prime Minister of Norway at the time later reflected on the struggles, the issues, and the difficulty in trying to predict future energy needs.
Hvis man ser tilbake på 70- og 80-tallet, så var altså
Looking back at the 70s and 80s, it is obvious that the forecasts of rising energy demand were not completely justified. It underlines the difficulties of making energy prognoses. But that is just what you can see afterwards, when you know how things have developed.
When it comes to life, I think that it's not enough with what I call number one point of deep ecology movement, namely that each living being has a value in itself. We have also to add a second point about diversity, the manifold, the richness. There's something there that I think is very deep going intuition you have also in life, that you wish to conform, but you also delight in a difference.
Oh, I don't think diversity is a value in itself. And the problem with the stress that ecologists put on diversity is that it's very unclear what counts as greater diversity. For example, if you allow raw sewage to flow into a previously pristine river, you will greatly increase the number of microbes who exist in that river. So in one sense, you've enormously increased the diversity living in the river. But most ecologists don't value this kind of diversity. So really they owe us an explanation of precisely what kind of diversity it is that they value. And when you look at it, it usually turns out to be something that you can understand in other terms, like aesthetic value of a richly diverse forest, or maybe the greater stability you get from the richly diverse forest, but not diversity in itself.
And what about the many life forms in the Malaysian jungle? They too are affected by the decision about the dam. Are they only means to human happiness, or do they count in a utilitarian appraisal? Interestingly, Bentham thought they should.
Jo, jag tror att det var nog revolutionerande det här som Bentham säger, att frågan inte om de kan tänka eller
Bentham's theories about animals being able to sense pain and pleasure was the main and revolutionary question. If this is the case, then animals are completely included in the moral community.
Värde så att säga som ska beaktas.
It is still a revolutionary standpoint if one listens to Peter Singer and other utilitarian thinkers who propagate this view.
Utilitarister fortsätter att driva den här tesen.
If you recognize that other animals are sentient beings, then they have interests. For example, they have an interest in not feeling pain. You then have to ask yourself, well, does the fact that the animal is a dog or a pig or a giraffe or a chimpanzee mean that the pain suffered by that animal is less significant than the pain suffered by a member of the species Homo sapiens? And I think you only have to ask yourself that question to see that the answer is no. I mean, how can it make a difference to the wrongness of pain just because of the species to which the being who suffers pain belongs? That doesn't make any more sense to me than saying that the pain of a European is more important than the pain of an African, which is clearly nonsense.
What is the answer? Should one build the dam or not? One might expect utilitarianism to favor the dam, to weigh benefits over costs. Instead, it suggests reasons pro and con, and perhaps that's its chief value: to call attention to gains and sacrifices on all sides, and to propose that we try to weigh them.
But real-life politics isn't usually that easy. Real-life politics usually involves advance to some at the suffering of others. And utilitarianism, rightly or wrongly, is one of its harsher aspects, has an account of such sacrifice, or when such sacrifice is justified, when it's right to sacrifice the interest of one person for the sake of others. That's the big argument always in favour of the other view, of the rights view, which is the claim that it would always be wrong to sacrifice one person for the sake of others. But I think it's an inevitable part of the world living together of politics, and therefore it's much better, it seems to me, to have a theory such as utilitarianism that doesn't just back off the idea we can never sacrifice the interests of some for the sake of others, but rather in a reasoned and thoughtful way tries to work out when it's right to sacrifice the interests of some instead of others. In other words, it takes that problem on and tries to resolve it, rather than saying we'll never touch it.
The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.